The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a warm amber glow over the quiet neighborhood streets. It was the kind of evening where children's laughter echoed through the air, mingling with the rustle of leaves as a gentle breeze swept through. Among the small crowd of kids playing tag near the park, a boy with a bright, infectious smile and a kind demeanor stood out. He wasn't the loudest or the fastest, but he had a way of making everyone feel included, a rare quality for someone his age. Barely into his teens, the boy carried an unshakable sense of responsibility. He had always been the one to lend a hand, whether it was helping his neighbors carry groceries or offering his seat to someone on a crowded bus. People admired him for it, even if they didn't always say so. But kindness, while beautiful, often went unnoticed in the everyday rush of life. The evening seemed like any other until a sudden commotion shattered the calm. A little girl, no older than 5, had wandered away from her family. She clutched a small red balloon, her tiny legs carrying her faster than her distracted parents realized. Her giggles blended into the noise of the nearby street, a place she shouldn't have been so close to. It was one of those moments that could shift from harmless to catastrophic in the blink of an eye. And in that instant, time seemed to slow. The boy noticed her first, his sharp eyes catching the unmistakable danger that others missed. The balloon slipped from her grasp, floating upward, and she chased it without hesitation straight toward the busy road where cars zipped by in an unending stream. The boy's heart clenched as he saw the oncoming traffic. Horns blared, tires screeched, and the little girl was oblivious to it all. For a split second, he hesitated. He wasn't sure if he could make it in time, but the thought of doing nothing wasn't an option. His legs moved before his mind could catch up, propelling him forward with a determination fueled by something deeper than fear. The world around him became a blur. He weaved through the park's narrow pathway, leaping over benches and dodging startled onlookers. Every beat of his heart felt like thunder in his ears, and yet there was clarity in his movements. All that mattered was reaching her. By now, the little girl was only a few steps away from the edge of the road. A truck barreled down the street, its driver unaware of the child in his path. Gasps rippled through the air as people began to realize what was happening, but no one was close enough to act, no one except the boy. He reached her just in time. With an outstretched arm, he grabbed her wrist and yanked her back with all the strength he could muster. The momentum sent them both sprawling onto the pavement, narrowly avoiding the truck's tires. The driver slammed the brakes, the sound of screeching metal piercing the air, but the vehicle came to a halt just a few feet away from where they lay. The little girl was safe, clutching his shirt as tears streamed down her face, but the boy had taken the brunt of the fall. His knees were scraped, and his elbow throbbed where it had hit the ground. Still, he sat up, his first instinct to comfort her. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "You're safe now." The crowd, frozen in shock moments ago, erupted into a flurry of motion. Adults rushed toward them, some checking on the boy, others tending to the little girl. Her parents arrived moments later, their faces pale with fear and guilt. The mother scooped up her daughter, holding her close as tears of relief streamed down her face. "Thank you," she whispered to the boy, her voice breaking. "You saved her life." But he didn't seem to care about the praise. His focus was still on the little girl, making sure she wasn't hurt. She looked at him with wide, teary eyes, her earlier fear replaced by something resembling awe. "You're my hero," she murmured, her tiny voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. The boy offered her a small, reassuring smile, but before he could respond, he felt a sharp pain in his side. His adrenaline had masked it initially, but now it was impossible to ignore. He winced, trying to hide it, not wanting to make a fuss. The last thing he wanted was to worry anyone further. But the people around him weren't blind to his discomfort. Someone called for an ambulance, and though he protested, insisting he was fine, the concern on their faces silenced him. As they waited, the atmosphere shifted. Strangers who had been busy with their own lives just moments ago were now united in their admiration for the boy's bravery. Words like selfless and heroic floated through the air, but he remained modest, almost embarrassed by the attention. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics gently helped him onto a stretcher. The little girl reached out to him, her tiny hand brushing against his. "Thank you," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice soft but steady. As the ambulance doors closed, the crowd watched in silence, their admiration for the boy palpable. News of the incident spread quickly. By the time he reached the hospital, the story had already made its way to local headlines. People were captivated by the tale of the kind boy who had risked everything to save a little girl he didn't even know. His actions sparked conversations about courage, kindness, and the power of selflessness, qualities that often seemed rare in a world too preoccupied with its own chaos. But for the boy, none of it felt extraordinary. To him, it was simply the right thing to do. As he lay in the hospital bed, his injuries tended to by gentle hands, he couldn't help but think about the little girl's smile and the relief in her parents' eyes. That was enough for him. Still, the weight of what he had done lingered. He had faced danger head on, not for recognition, but because he couldn't stand the thought of something happening to her. And as the night deepened, he found himself wondering if faced with the same choice again, would he do it? The answer came to him almost instantly. Of course, he would. And while he couldn't know it yet, this one act of bravery would set off a chain of events that would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The boy's room at the hospital was quiet except for the soft beeping of the monitors. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts swirling. The white walls around him felt confining, a stark contrast to the freedom of the park just hours ago. His body ached, but it wasn't the pain that bothered him, it was the attention. The nurses smiled at him like he was a hero, and every time someone walked into the room, they seemed to look at him differently. He didn't like it. All he wanted was to go back to being unnoticed, to blend into the background like he always had. Later that evening, the boy's parents arrived. His mother's face was a mixture of worry and pride, her eyes red from crying. She rushed to his side, taking his hand gently. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm fine," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. It wasn't a big deal. His father stood a few steps behind, his arms crossed but his expression soft. "Not a big deal," he repeated. "You ran into traffic to save a little girl." "That's not nothing, son." The boy shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the blanket covering his legs. "I just didn't want her to get hurt," he murmured. His parents exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them. They didn't push him further, sensing his reluctance to talk about it. Instead, his mother smoothed his hair back and told him how proud she was, her voice filled with warmth. That night, as the hospital quieted down and the world outside seemed to settle, the boy's mind drifted. He thought about the little girl, her tear-streaked face, and the way she looked at him with such trust. He thought about the truck, the screech of its tires, and the brief but terrifying realization that he might not make it in time. The images played over and over, each one as vivid as if it had just happened. He didn't notice when he drifted off to sleep, but his dreams were restless. He was back at the park, the laughter and sunlight replaced by shadows and silence. He ran toward the little girl, but no matter how fast he moved, the truck was always closer. He woke with a start, his heart racing, and it took him a moment to remember where he was. The next morning, the boy was surprised to find a small crowd gathered outside his hospital room. Reporters with cameras and notepads jostled for space, their voices overlapping as they asked questions. "How does it feel to be a hero? What made you act so quickly? Did you think about your own safety at all?" He froze, unsure of what to do. He hadn't expected this kind of attention, and he certainly didn't want it. Before he could say anything, a nurse appeared, her expression firm as she ushered the reporters away. She closed the door behind her and turned to the boy with a gentle smile. "Don't worry about them," she said. "They just want a story. You focus on getting better." The boy nodded, grateful for her kindness, but the encounter left him unsettled. He couldn't understand why everyone was making such a fuss. He had just done what anyone would have, hadn't he? As the days passed, the story spread. It was on the local news, then the national news. People started calling him a hero, a role model. He heard whispers in the hallways, saw strangers pointing at him and smiling as they passed. It was overwhelming, and he didn't know how to handle it. At school, things were different too. He had always been the quiet one, the kid who stayed out of trouble and kept to himself. But now, everyone wanted to talk to him. His classmates asked him endless questions, and teachers praised him in front of the entire class. It should have felt good, but instead, it made him feel even more out of place. Meanwhile, the little girl's family reached out to thank him. They invited him and his parents over for dinner, a gesture of gratitude that they insisted on despite his protests. The boy was hesitant at first, unsure of how to face them after everything that had happened. But his parents convinced him to go, reminding him that it was important to let people show their appreciation. The dinner was warm and welcoming, the little girl's parents expressing their gratitude with every word. They told him how much it meant to them, how they couldn't imagine what their lives would have been like if he hadn't been there. The little girl herself seemed shy at first, hiding behind her mother's leg, but eventually, she worked up the courage to sit beside him at the table. She handed him a drawing she had made, a simple picture of him with a cape, standing tall like a superhero. The boy couldn't help but smile, even as his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I'm not a superhero," he said softly, looking at the little girl. "I was just in the right place at the right time." But her parents disagreed. "You were brave," her father said. "That's not something everyone can say." As the evening went on, the boy began to feel more at ease. The family's gratitude was genuine, and their warmth was infectious. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to feel a small sense of pride, not for the attention, but for knowing he had made a difference. But even as life began to settle into a new rhythm, something lingered in the back of the boy's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something just out of reach. The memory of the incident was so vivid, almost too vivid, as if it had etched itself into his mind in a way that felt unnatural. He found himself replaying it over and over, trying to understand why it had happened the way it did. And then there was the little girl. She had been so quick to trust him, so certain that he would keep her safe. It was as if she had known, even before he had, that he would act. The thought made him uneasy, though he couldn't quite explain why. The boy began to notice small, inexplicable things. People he didn't recognize seemed to know him, stopping him on the street to thank him or ask for his picture. Sometimes, he caught snippets of conversations that felt oddly familiar, as if they were about him but spoken in hushed tones. He started to feel like he was being watched, though whenever he turned around, there was never anyone there. One evening, as he sat by his bedroom window, watching the world outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had shifted in some profound way. He didn't understand it yet, but he knew that what had happened at the park was just the beginning. And somewhere out there, someone or something was waiting. The weeks that followed felt like a blur to the boy. He tried to go back to his usual life, but it seemed impossible. Everywhere he went, there were reminders of what had happened. Strangers stopped him in the grocery store, children pointed at him in awe, and adults spoke to him like he had done something miraculous. Even his teachers treated him differently, calling on him more often in class and smiling at him in a way that made him feel even more out of place. At first, he tried to ignore it. He told himself that people would forget soon enough, that their lives would move on and his would go back to normal. But as time passed, the attention didn't fade. Instead, it grew. He started hearing his name mentioned on the news, and one morning, his face was on the front page of the local newspaper. The headline read, "Teen Hero Saves Little Girl, a Story of Courage and Kindness." The boy couldn't bring himself to read the article. He didn't want to relive the moment again, didn't want to see his life summarized in neat paragraphs for others to consume. But the world wasn't letting him forget. His classmates treated him like a celebrity, asking for stories and details he didn't want to share. Even his closest friends seemed to look at him differently now, their conversations awkward and stilted. At home, things weren't much better. His parents were proud of him, of course, but they didn't seem to understand how all the attention was affecting him. His mother often reminded him that he had done something incredible, something worth celebrating, while his father told him to get used to it because heroes don't get to hide. But he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a boy who had made a choice in the heat of the moment, a choice anyone would have made. The unease he'd felt since the accident only grew stronger. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, became harder to ignore. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. But then he started noticing things, subtle movements in the corner of his vision, the faint sound of footsteps that seemed to disappear when he turned around. One evening, as he walked home from the store, he caught a glimpse of a dark figure standing beneath a street lamp. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, watching. The boy froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to convince himself it was just a stranger, someone waiting for a bus or a friend. But something about the way they stood, so still and silent, made his skin crawl. He quickened his pace, clutching the bag of groceries tightly as he hurried home. When he glanced back, the figure was gone. The strange occurrences didn't stop there. His phone began receiving out messages, blank texts from unknown numbers, or strings of random letters and numbers that didn't make sense. One night, he woke to the sound of a faint tapping on his window. He sat up, his heart racing, but when he looked outside, there was nothing there. Just the empty street bathed in the orange glow of the streetlights. The boy tried to talk to his parents about it, but they dismissed his concerns as paranoia. His mother told him he was probably just stressed, while his father laughed it off, saying, "You're letting all this attention get to your head." Even his friends seemed skeptical, joking that maybe his fans were getting a little too excited. But the boy knew something wasn't right. The feeling of being watched became a constant presence, following him everywhere he went. He began to notice the same car parked near his house, the same man sitting at the corner CAF, always with a newspaper held just high enough to cover his face. He tried to convince himself it was a coincidence, but deep down, he knew better. One evening, as he sat in his room trying to focus on his homework, he heard a faint noise outside. It wasn't the usual sounds of the neighborhood, the hum of cars, the distant bark of a dog. This was different. It was a low, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking softly on glass. His stomach tightened as he turned toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but the sound was unmistakable. He stood slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, and pulled the curtains aside. For a moment, he saw nothing but his reflection staring back at him. Then, just as he was about to step away, he noticed a faint outline in the darkness. Someone was standing in his yard, barely visible in the shadows. The boy's breath caught in his throat. He backed away from the window, his hands shaking as he reached for his phone. He dialed his father's number, but it rang and rang with no answer. Panic surged through him as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. He didn't know what to do. Should he call the police? Was it even real, or was his mind playing tricks on him? Before he could decide, the figure moved. It stepped closer to the house, into the light of the porch, and for the first time, the boy saw its face. It was a man, older, with sharp features and cold eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. The man didn't say a word. He just stared at the boy through the window, his expression unreadable. The boy's fingers fumbled as he tried to call his mother instead. This time, she picked up, her voice calm and unaware. "What's wrong, honey?" she asked. "There's someone outside," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He's just standing there." His mother's tone shifted immediately, a mixture of concern and disbelief. "What do you mean?" "Are you sure?" "Yes," he insisted, his voice rising. "He's right there. He's looking at me." There was a pause, and then his mother's voice came back, firm and reassuring. "Lock the doors. Stay inside. I'm coming home right now." The boy did as she said, bolting the front and back doors and checking every window in the house. But when he returned to his room, the man was gone. The yard was empty, the shadows undisturbed. It was as if he had never been there at all. When his mother arrived, she found him sitting on the couch, his face pale and his hands still trembling. She searched the yard and the street, but there was no sign of the man. She tried to comfort him, telling him it was probably just a prank or a misunderstanding. But the boy couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more, something far more sinister. As the days passed, the boy's world felt increasingly uncertain. The mysterious man didn't appear again, but the sense of being watched remained. He started noticing small things: a book moved from its usual spot, a door left slightly ajar when he was certain he'd closed it. He felt like he was losing control, like the life he had known was slipping away piece by piece. And then, one night, it all came to a head. The boy was lying in bed, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but his mind too restless to let him sleep. The house was silent, the kind of deep quiet that felt oppressive rather than comforting. Just as he was starting to drift off, he heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside the house. The boy froze, his heart hammering in his chest as the sound of the tapping echoed through the quiet house. It was faint but deliberate, the kind of noise that couldn't be brushed off as the creak of an old floorboard or the settling of the walls. He strained his ears, holding his breath, trying to pinpoint its source. It wasn't the windows this time, it was closer. Much closer. Slowly, he slipped out of bed, his bare feet barely making a sound on the floor. He crept toward his bedroom door, his pulse pounding in his ears. The hallway was dark, the faint glow of the streetlights outside casting long shadows that seemed to shift as he moved. The tapping came again, steady and rhythmic, and now he was certain it was coming from downstairs. The boy hesitated, his mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was his parents. Maybe one of them had gotten up and accidentally knocked something over. But the rational part of him dismissed the thought. His mother always checked on him before bed, and his father worked the night shift. He wasn't due home for hours. Gripping the banister, he descended the stairs one step at a time, each creak of the wood beneath his weight making him wince. The living room stretched out before him, dim and still. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but the tapping persisted, louder now, coming from the kitchen. He edged closer, his hands trembling as he reached for the light switch. The kitchen flooded with a harsh, fluorescent glow, and for a moment he felt a wave of relief. There was nothing there. The counters were clear, the chairs pushed neatly under the table. But just as he was about to turn back, he saw a single, faint smudge on the glass of the back door, at the height of someone's fingertips. The boy's breath caught. He stared at the smudge, his mind spinning. Someone had been here, right outside. He moved closer, peering out into the yard, but the night was still and empty, the shadows undisturbed. He locked the door quickly, double-checking the latch, and backed away, his hands clammy. As he turned to leave the kitchen, a faint noise stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't the tapping this time, it was a whisper, soft and indistinct, coming from somewhere nearby. The boy's blood ran cold. He whipped around, searching for the source, but the room was empty. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. He waited, his heart pounding, but no one answered. He bolted up the stairs and locked himself in his room, his mind racing with fear and confusion. He wanted to call someone, his mother, the police, but he couldn't find the courage to move. What would he even say? That he'd heard tapping and whispers? That someone had left a smudge on the glass? It sounded ridiculous, even to him. The boy didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, watching the street below, his eyes darting to every flicker of movement. But the night passed without incident, and by morning, the world outside seemed normal again. At school, he tried to shake off the unease. His friends were their usual chatty selves, talking about homework and weekend plans, oblivious to the turmoil in his mind. He wanted to tell someone, to share what he'd experienced, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he plastered on a smile and nodded along, pretending everything was fine. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. Over the next few days, small things began to go missing around the house: his favorite book, a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, even a pair of shoes. At first, he thought he was just being forgetful, but the items never turned up, no matter how hard he looked. Then, one evening, he found something that made his blood run cold. Tucked under his pillow was a small piece of paper, folded neatly. His hands shook as he unfolded it, revealing a single, chilling sentence written in blocky, uneven letters: "You're not safe." The boy's stomach churned. He stared at the note, his mind racing. Who had put it there? How had they gotten into his room? He felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. This wasn't just strange anymore, it was a direct threat. He showed the note to his mother, his voice trembling as he explained what had been happening. Her face paled, and for the first time, she seemed to take his concerns seriously. She called the police, who arrived later that evening to take a report. They searched the house and the yard but found no signs of forced entry or evidence of anyone lurking nearby. The officer tried to reassure them, saying it was probably a prank or a misunderstanding. But the boy wasn't convinced. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more, something deliberate. The sense of being watched had only grown stronger, and now, he couldn't even feel safe in his own home. That night, he stayed awake again, clutching a baseball bat he'd found in the garage. The house was silent, the kind of oppressive quiet that made every creak and rustle seem magnified. Hours passed, and he started to feel his eyelids grow heavy, his grip on the bat loosening. Just as he was about to drift off, a new sound shattered the silence. This time, it wasn't tapping or whispers. It was the unmistakable creak of a floorboard inside the house. The boy's heart leapt into his throat. He gripped the bat tightly, his hands slick with sweat, and listened. The creak came again, closer this time. He held his breath, straining to hear, and then it came, a faint, deliberate footstep just outside his bedroom door. The door handle turned slowly, the sound sending a jolt of fear through him. He backed away, his eyes locked on the door as it inched open. A shadow loomed in the doorway, tall and dark, and the boy felt a surge of adrenaline. But before he could react, the figure stepped into the light, and his breath caught. It wasn't a stranger. It was the man from the yard, the same cold eyes, the same unreadable expression. But now, there was something else in his gaze, something that made the boy's skin crawl. It wasn't just cold, it was knowing. The man spoke, his voice low and deliberate, each word sending a chill down the boy's spine. "You should have stayed quiet," he said. And then he smiled, a slow, chilling smile that made the boy realize this was far from over. The boy stood frozen, the bat trembling in his hands as the man took another step into the room. His presence was suffocating, the air feeling heavy with a threat that went beyond words. The boy's mind raced, searching for any way to escape, any plan that might save him. But the man's cold gaze held him in place, as if daring him to move. "I didn't want it to come to this," the man said, his voice eerily calm. "But you've made it impossible to ignore. You've seen too much, and now we have to fix that." The boy's fear was overridden by a sudden surge of defiance. He didn't know what this man wanted or why he'd been following him, but he refused to go down without a fight. He gripped the bat tighter, his knuckles white, and took a step back, putting as much distance as he could between them. "What do you want from me?" the boy demanded, his voice shaking but firm. "I didn't do anything to you." The man tilted his head, his smile widening, but there was no warmth in it. "It's not about what you've done. It's about what you represent. A boy like you, getting all this attention, becoming a symbol of something you don't even understand. That's dangerous." Before the boy could process the man's cryptic words, there was a sudden, loud crash from downstairs. The noise startled them both, and for a split second, the man's focus shifted. The boy seized the opportunity, swinging the bat with all his strength. It connected with the man's arm, causing him to stumble back with a grunt of pain. The boy didn't wait to see what would happen next. He bolted past the man and down the stairs, his heart pounding like a drum. The house felt like a maze, every shadow stretching out toward him, but he didn't stop. He needed to get out, to find help, to survive. Reaching the front door, he fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking so badly that it took several tries before he managed to open it. Just as he stepped outside, he heard the man's heavy footsteps behind him. He didn't look back. He ran. The street was eerily quiet, the only sound his ragged breaths and the pounding of his feet against the pavement. He headed toward the only place he could think of, the small park a few blocks away, where he knew he could find cover among the trees. His legs burned, his lungs felt like they were on fire, but he didn't dare slow down. As he reached the park, the boy darted into the shadows, weaving between the trees and shrubs, hoping to lose the man. He crouched low, his chest heaving, trying to listen for any sign of pursuit. The silence was deafening, every rustle of leaves making him jump. He didn't know how long he sat there, trembling and trying to catch his breath, before he heard a low, deliberate chuckle. "You're resourceful," the man's voice called out, closer than he'd expected. "I'll give you that. But this isn't a game you can win." The boy's panic threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to think. He scanned the area, searching for anything he could use, any way to gain an advantage. His eyes landed on a large branch lying nearby, its jagged edges sharp and splintered. He grabbed it, his hands steady despite the fear coursing through him. The man emerged from the shadows, his silhouette tall and menacing. He moved slowly, confidently, as if he already knew the outcome. "It's over," he said, his tone almost mocking. "Come out, and I promise I'll make this quick." The boy didn't respond. He held his breath, waiting until the man was just a few steps away. Then, with every ounce of strength he had left, he lunged forward, swinging the branch in a wide arc. The man wasn't expecting it. The branch struck him across the chest, knocking him to the ground. The boy didn't wait to see if he'd stay down. He ran again, this time toward the streetlights in the distance. His feet pounded against the pavement, his mind racing with thoughts of escape. But as he neared the edge of the park, he heard the man's voice again, faint but unmistakable. "You can't run forever." The boy didn't look back. He kept running until he reached a neighbor's house, banging on the door with all his might. A light flickered on inside, and moments later, an older man opened the door, his face etched with concern. The boy tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush, but before he could finish, the man behind him spoke again, his voice chillingly calm. "He's lying." The neighbor hesitated, his eyes darting between the boy and the man standing at the edge of the yard. The boy felt a surge of desperation. "Please," he begged. "He's been following me. He broke into my house." But the man in the yard shook his head, his expression calm and composed. "I'm his uncle," he said, his voice steady. "He's been having a rough time lately, imagining things. I'm just trying to bring him home." The boy's stomach dropped. He could see the doubt in the neighbor's eyes, the way the man's calm demeanor seemed to outweigh his own panicked pleas. "No!" he shouted. "He's lying! Please, you have to believe me!" Before the neighbor could respond, a police car pulled up to the curb, its lights flashing. The boy's heart soared with relief as two officers stepped out. He ran to them, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "He's been following me. He broke into my house." The man in the yard didn't flinch. He raised his hands, his expression calm. "It's a misunderstanding," he said. "The boy's been through a lot. I was just trying to help." The officers exchanged a glance before turning back to the boy. "We'll get this sorted," one of them said. "But first, let's make sure you're safe." As the boy explained everything, every detail of the past few weeks, he noticed something strange. The man wasn't protesting. He stood there, quiet and composed, as if he knew something they didn't. The boy's unease grew, but he pushed through, determined to make them believe him. In the end, the officers took the man into custody, promising to investigate further. The boy felt a wave of relief as the man was led away, his cold gaze lingering for a moment before he disappeared into the back of the police car. But as the boy sat in the neighbor's house, waiting for his mother to arrive, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. He glanced at the piece of paper he'd found under his pillow earlier that night. The words stared back at him, more ominous than ever, "You're not safe." It was only then that he noticed the faint imprint of another set of words, written on the back of the note. He held it up to the light, his hands trembling as he read the faint message, "He's not the only one." The boy stared at the faint words on the back of the note, his heart sinking as the message sank in. He's not the only one. A chill ran down his spine, and the relief he'd felt just moments ago dissolved into a deeper sense of unease. Who else could be involved? And why him? He tried to steady his breathing, telling himself it could mean anything. Maybe it was just another cruel attempt to scare him. But no matter how hard he tried, the words wouldn't leave his mind. When his mother arrived, she rushed to his side, pulling him into a tight embrace. He could feel her trembling as she asked what had happened, her voice cracking with worry. He told her everything, from the strange tapping sounds to the man breaking into the house. She listened, her expression shifting between anger and fear, and promised that she would do everything to keep him safe. The police followed up with questions, trying to piece together the events. They assured the boy and his mother that the man in custody would face charges for breaking into the house and stalking him. But when the boy brought up the note, especially the second message, the officers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them leaned forward and said gently, "We'll look into this, but for now, let's focus on what we can prove. You're safe, and that's what matters." The boy nodded, but their reassurances did little to calm him. That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, sent his heart racing. His mother had stayed up too, sitting in the living room with the lights on, as if trying to keep the darkness at bay. Over the next few days, life slowly began to return to normal, at least on the surface. The boy went back to school, trying to catch up on assignments and fit in with his friends again. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The unease followed him everywhere, on the bus, in the hallways, even in the safety of his home. He started noticing small things out of place: a pencil moved from his desk, a door left slightly ajar, a shadow that disappeared too quickly. His mother decided to take extra precautions. She installed security cameras around the house and changed all the locks. The police had advised her to stay vigilant, but they hadn't found any evidence of others involved, at least not yet. The boy wanted to believe the danger was gone, that the man's arrest had ended it all, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. One evening, as the boy sat at his desk trying to focus on his homework, a notification popped up on his phone. It was from the security camera app his mother had set up. His stomach twisted as he opened it, revealing a live feed from the front yard. At first, He saw nothing unusual, just the empty driveway and the faint glow of the street lights. But then, in the corner of the frame, he noticed movement. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, barely visible in the shadows. They didn't move closer, didn't approach the house. They just stood there, watching. The boy's chest tightened, and he called for his mother. She rushed into the room, and when she saw the screen, her face paled. She grabbed her phone and called the police, her voice shaking as she explained what they were seeing. The figure vanished before the police arrived, leaving no trace behind. The officers searched the area and reviewed the camera footage but couldn't identify the person. They promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood, but their words felt hollow. The boy and his mother both knew this wasn't over. The next day at school, the boy confided in a teacher he trusted, hoping for advice or even just a sense of comfort. The teacher listened carefully, nodding as the boy explained everything that had happened. "You're brave for speaking up," the teacher said. "But you don't have to face this alone. We'll find a way to help." That afternoon, the boy returned home to find his uncle waiting in the living room. His mother had called him, hoping he could provide some extra support. The boy's uncle was a quiet, steady presence, and his calm demeanor helped ease some of the tension. They talked late into the evening, and for the first time in days, the boy felt a flicker of hope. His uncle promised to stay with them for a while, keeping watch and helping them feel safe. The days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences gradually stopped. No more shadows in the yard, no more notes left behind, no more signs of anyone lurking nearby. The boy began to relax, allowing himself to believe that the worst was behind him. He focused on his schoolwork, spent time with his friends, and even started sleeping through the night again. But one night, as he lay in bed, he was awakened by a faint noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping. His heart sank. He sat up, straining to listen, and realized it was coming from his window. Slowly, he got up and pulled back the curtain. His breath caught when he saw a bird, its small beak tapping against the glass. It flapped its wings and flew off into the night, leaving him staring out into the darkness. He couldn't shake the feeling that the bird's appearance was more than coincidence. He thought about the note, the strange message on the back, and everything that had happened. There were still questions left unanswered, pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. But he also knew he couldn't let fear control him. He had faced danger and survived. He had spoken up when it mattered most. And now, he was determined to move forward. The boy and his mother decided to make some changes, starting with moving to a new neighborhood. It was a difficult decision, leaving behind the house and the memories they had built there, but it felt like the right choice. In their new home, they created new routines, finding ways to rebuild their sense of safety and normalcy. Though the boy's life gradually returned to normal, the experience left a lasting impact. He grew more cautious, more aware of his surroundings, but also more resilient. He learned to trust his instincts, to speak up when something felt wrong, and to lean on the people who cared about him. In time, the memories of those dark days began to fade, replaced by brighter ones. But every now and then, he would think about the man, the note, and the shadowy figure in the yard. He never found out the full story, never discovered who else might have been involved or what their motives were. But he chose to focus on what he could control: his own strength, his own courage, and the people who stood by him when he needed them most. The boy's story became a quiet reminder to those around him about the importance of vigilance, bravery, and community. It wasn't just about the fear he faced or the danger he escaped. It was about the way he chose to keep going, even when the path ahead was uncertain. And in the end, that choice made all the difference.